His name was not Edward Thatch. Nobody who actually met the man ever called him that. Every sailor, every merchant captain, every colonial officer who crossed paths with Blackbeard and bothered to write down used one name: Thatch, sometimes Take. The name Teach comes from a single book published 6 years after he died, written by someone using a fake name, and now considered closer to fiction than history. So before we get into anything else, understand that the most basic fact about Blackbeard, the two syllables on every Wikipedia page and every History Channel special, is wrong. It was always wrong. That book, A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724 under the pseudonym Captain Charles Johnson, is the source of nearly everything the public thinks it knows about Blackbeard. The author's real identity is still debated. For decades, scholars assumed it was Daniel Defoe, the novelist who wrote Robinson Crusoe. That attribution has largely collapsed under scrutiny, and the true author remains unknown. What is known is that the book was not written as history. The Oxford Research Encyclopedia of African History does not mince words about it. It is not a historical primary source, but a literary one. Johnson gave Blackbeard mythical status using considerable artistic license. He altered the account to produce a more exciting and colorful story. There are theories that Johnson was paid by the British government to slander pirates as part of an active anti-piracy propaganda campaign. The man who wrote the Blackbeard story may have been working for the people who killed him. And yet, every documentary, every movie, every retelling of the Blackbeard legend draws from Johnson like scripture. What follows is what the primary sources actually say. The depositions, the colonial letters, the archaeological record from the only pirate shipwreck ever scientifically excavated. A different man emerges. Younger than you expect, less violent than the legend demands, and tangled up in a political conspiracy that had nothing to do with piracy at all. Start with who he was. The traditional story puts Blackbeard's birth in Bristol, England around 1680. Bristol was the second largest city in England at the time, a center of transatlantic trade and, bluntly, the slave trade. But in 2014 and 2015, maritime historian Baylus Brooks pulled together a different origin story using Jamaican government records and Church of England baptismal entries. Brooks found a man named Edward Thatch who was a respected ship captain and man of considerable social status in Spanish town Jamaica. He found the baptismal record of Cox Thatch, son of Edward and Lucretia Tayac, born in Spanish town in 1700, likely Blackbeard's half-brother. He found a 1706 document written aboard HMS Windsor in which a young Edward Thatch signed over his late father's estate to his stepmother Lucretia, citing love and affection for his brother and sister Thomas Thatch. Ship Captain Edward Vernon, who lived in Jamaica from 1708 to 1712, knew the family personally and wrote that Blackbeard was indeed born in Jamaica. Brooks is careful to say he cannot prove with certainty that his Thatch and Blackbeard are the same person, but the circumstantial evidence is strong enough that other scholars find his case compelling. If Brooks is right, Blackbeard was not some poor Bristol dock worker who turned to crime out of desperation. He was born into a wealthy Jamaican planter family, people who owned enslaved Africans and held social standing in the most lucrative colony in the Caribbean. Jamaica in the 1680s and 1690s was in the middle of a sugar boom. Sugar was white gold, more profitable than tobacco, more reliable than silver mining. Planters who secured good land and enough enslaved labor could build fortunes in a generation. The family may have left Bristol while Blackbeard was young, chasing that sugar money. The traditional image of Blackbeard as a man driven to piracy by poverty falls apart under this reading. He came from money. He chose piracy for reasons that were probably more complicated than hunger. Then there is the question of age. The common image shows Blackbeard as a grizzled, weathered man, late 30s or 40s, all beard and scar tissue. That image comes from a single 1724 engraving by an artist who never laid eyes on him. Historian Kevin Duffus has made a case that Blackbeard died at approximately age 27. That would put him right at the median age for pirates during the Golden Age. If Duffus is right, the most feared man on the Atlantic seaboard was younger than most people watching this video. He terrorized an entire coastline as a 20-something. And about that terror, the reputation, the legend, the nightmares he gave colonial merchants from Carolina to the Caribbean. Blackbeard never killed anyone. Not a single confirmed kill before his final battle at Ocracoke. Charles Ewan, the East Carolina University archaeologist who has spent years working on the Queen Anne's Revenge wreck, has said it directly. No evidence exists that he ever killed anyone before that last fight. Kevin Duffus puts it the same way. He does not know that Blackbeard ever harmed anyone until his final night at Ocracoke. There were dozens of eyewitness accounts from his victims. Ship captains, merchants, crew members who were boarded and robbed. Not one of them describes Blackbeard killing anyone. Not one describes him seriously injuring anyone. The accounts describe him treating ship captains cordially. The most feared pirate in the Atlantic was, by every surviving first-person testimony, polite. His operation ran on psychology, not butchery. The protocol was straightforward and consistent across dozens of encounters. Fire a cannon across the bow of a target ship as a warning shot, then hoist the pirate flag. Usually that was enough. The merchants saw the black flag, did the math on whether their cargo was worth dying for, and surrendered without a fight. The answer was always no. His common boarding tactic was to run ships aground, take what he wanted, and let the crew leave unharmed. He rarely burned captured vessels. He wanted the goods, not the destruction. Ewan summarized it well. Scaring people was a better option than damaging what you're trying to steal. Blackbeard understood something that a surprising number of violent criminals never figure out. Violence is expensive. It draws attention from navies, it damages sellable cargo, it turns neutral parties into enemies. Fear costs nothing. Fear is self-replicating. Every terrified merchant who reached port and told the story did Blackbeard's advertising for him. The slow match story is the single most repeated visual detail about Blackbeard. Lit fuses woven into his beard, smoking and hissing, making him look like a demon walking out of hell. It is almost certainly wrong. The matches were real, but they were tucked under his hat, not woven into his beard, and the reason was not intimidation. Mosquitoes were vicious in coastal Carolina waters. Slow-burning fuses were a common insect repellent. Duffus calls the terrifying fuse theory entirely illogical and impractical, noting the fuses would have frightened Blackbeard himself more than anyone else. The most iconic detail about Blackbeard was bug spray. His flag, the one you have seen on every t-shirt and every pirate-themed bar sign, the horned skeleton holding an hourglass and spearing a bleeding heart, that was not his either. That attribution first appeared in Douglas Bodding's 1978 book, The Pirates. The period depositions from people who actually saw his flag describe it simply, a black flag with a skull. What historians call a death head. Everything else is 20th century invention. Then there is the Israel Hand story, the most famous example of Blackbeard's casual cruelty. During a drinking session below deck, Blackbeard drew 2 pistols and shot his own crewman Israel Hands in the knee, crippling him for life. When asked why, he said that if he did not now and then kill one of them, they would forget who he was. Some historians read this as calculated intimidation. If he would shoot a man he trusted, imagine what he would do to a stranger. The problem is that this story comes solely from Johnson's book. Israel Hands was a real person. He was captured alive and testified against his crewmates. But the shooting itself has no independent verification. It is a good story, it may even be true, but it is Johnson's story, not history's. Now the ship. Before she was Queen Anne's Revenge, the most famous pirate vessel in history, she was La Concorde. A 200-ton French slave ship owned by René Montaudoin, a member of the most prolific family in the French slave trade. The Montaudoin operation ran the triangular circuit that powered the Atlantic economy, manufactured goods from Nantes to the coast of West Africa, enslaved human beings from Africa to the Caribbean, sugar and colonial products from the Caribbean back to France. La Concorde worked this route in 1711, 1714, and 1717. The profits were enormous and the human cost was treated as a line item. Her final voyage as La Concorde began on March 24, 1717, departing Nantes under Captain Pierre d'Ossé. She reached Juda on the coast of what is now Benin and loaded her cargo. She departed on October 9, 1717, carrying 516 enslaved people packed into her hold. The Middle Passage killed 61 of them, a 12% mortality rate, which by the standards of the slave trade was considered acceptable. On November 28, 1717, near Martinique, Blackbeard's 2 sloops closed on her. The French crew was already gutted by disease, 16 men dead, another 36 prostrate with scurvy and dysentery. The survivors could barely work the sails, much less fight off 2 armed sloops. Blackbeard took the ship without meaningful resistance. He forced 10 French crewmen to stay aboard as sailors, gave the remaining French a Bermuda sloop and 3 tons of beans to feed the enslaved people they were transporting. What happened to those enslaved people after they reached Martinique goes unrecorded. Blackbeard mounted 40 cannons on her and gave her a new name, Queen Anne's Revenge. Named for Queen Anne, the last Stuart monarch who had died in 1714, the name is probably political. Blackbeard was likely a Jacobite, a supporter of the exiled Stuart dynasty who despised the German-speaking Hanoverian King George I, sitting on what Jacobites considered a stolen throne. Queen Anne's Revenge may have meant exactly what it said, revenge for the Stuart cause. Piracy as political protest against the king he considered illegitimate. It would explain why Blackbeard targeted primarily British and Hanoverian allied merchant ships. His career in piracy lasted 2 years. 2 years. From his first documented appearance in 1716 to his death in November 1718. But he was not new to the sea. He likely served as a British privateer during the War of Spanish Succession, known in the colonies as Queen Anne's War, from roughly 1701 to 1714. Privateering was legalized piracy. The Crown issued letters of marque authorizing private ships to raid French and Spanish vessels in Jamaican waters. When the war ended in 1714, thousands of privateersmen found themselves unemployed, trained in ship-to-ship combat, and offered nothing by the government that had used them. Many drifted to New Providence in the Bahamas, which by 1716 had become something between a failed colony and an open-air pirate market. Blackbeard sailed with Benjamin Hornigold, one of the pirate captains operating out of Nassau. Hornigold gave him command of a sloop. By late 1717, Hornigold was voted out by his own crew for refusing to attack British ships. Pirates did not tolerate a captain who left money on the table out of patriotism. Blackbeard took the fleet. In those 2 years, he became the most feared name on the ocean. But before we get to how he died, there is the matter of what he did at Charleston. In mid-May 1718, Blackbeard arrived off Charleston, South Carolina, with a 4-ship flotilla carrying at least 60 guns. At that moment, it was the most powerful maritime force in the Western Hemisphere. No colonial navy could match it, no shore battery could drive it away. He blocked the port for approximately 1 week. Every ship attempting to enter or leave Charleston was seized. He captured 8 or 9 vessels for supplies and took prominent hostages, including Samuel Wragg, a member of South Carolina's Provincial Grand Council. He threatened to kill all hostages and send their heads to the governor. His ransom demand was not gold, not silver, not jewels. Blackbeard wanted a chest of medicine. Governor Robert Johnson, who had no way to break the blockade militarily, agreed. The reason behind the demand was not mysterious. Blackbeard and his crew were almost certainly riddled with syphilis. The archaeological evidence backs this up. Among the over 400,000 artifacts recovered from the Queen Anne's Revenge wreck, conservators found a pewter urethral syringe with traces of mercury still on it. Mercury injected directly into the urethra was the standard syphilis treatment of the era. The procedure was agonizing. The cure could kill you through mercury poisoning almost as efficiently as the disease itself. They also found 2 pump clysters, which were rectal injection devices, and French-manufactured medical instruments. Think about what that means. The most feared pirate in the world, commanding the most powerful fleet in the hemisphere, held an entire colonial capital hostage. Not for treasure. For STD medicine. 3 weeks after Charleston, Blackbeard did something that most documentaries treat as an accident, but was almost certainly a chess move. On June 10, 1718, Queen Anne's Revenge ran aground at Beaufort Inlet, North Carolina, sometimes called Topsail Inlet. Most historians now believe he did it on purpose. Blackbeard was an experienced mariner who had been sailing the Carolina coast for months. He knew the sandbars, the tides, the depths. You do not accidentally ground a 40-gun warship in an inlet you have used before. He stripped the vessel of valuables beforehand. He deliberately marooned a portion of his crew on a sandbar, men he apparently had no further use for. By scuttling his own flagship, he went from commanding a conspicuous 4-ship fleet with hundreds of crew to operating a single small sloop with a handful of men he personally trusted. A small band seeking a pardon looks like a few reformed sailors. A fleet of 60 guns looks like an invasion force. He was positioning himself for what came next. Stedebonnet, the gentleman pirate who had been sailing with Blackbeard, accused him directly of grounding the ship to cheat the crew of their shores. Bonnet was a Barbados plantation owner who had abandoned his comfortable life for piracy, possibly to escape his wife. He had been sailing under Blackbeard's protection for months. When Blackbeard scuttled the ship and marooned men on the sandbar, Bonnet took it personally. He sailed off looking for revenge. He never found Blackbeard. Bonnet was captured, tried, and hanged in Charleston in December 1718, 1 month after Blackbeard's death. Blackbeard, meanwhile, presented himself to Governor Charles Eden in Bath, North Carolina, and accepted the king's pardon. Bath was a tiny settlement in the swamps of eastern North Carolina, the kind of place where a pardoned pirate with cheap goods and fighting men would be welcomed rather than feared. Blackbeard married there, reportedly to a woman about 16 years old, with Governor Eden performing the ceremony and Collector of Customs Tobias Knight attending as a guest. The only evidence naming his wife as Mary Ormond is a letter from a 20th century family member claiming it as family tradition. Duffus confirms the marriage happened but says her name was not Mary Ormond. Johnson's book claims Blackbeard had 13 or 14 wives. No documentation exists for any of them. The pardon did not last. By the fall of 1718, Blackbeard was operating out of Ocracoke again. And this is where the story that gets told in every documentary goes sideways. The conventional version says Virginia's Lieutenant Governor Alexander Spotswood, horrified by Blackbeard's piracy, sent Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy to bring him to justice. Noble government versus savage criminal. Clean and simple. Kevin Duffus calls it a failed coup d'etat, and his evidence is difficult to dismiss. The key players, Morris Moore and Edward Moseley, prominent plantation owners in North Carolina who wanted the colony converted from proprietary control to direct crown colony status. Governor Eden and Tobias Knight, who had pardoned Blackbeard and were profiting from his trade, and Spotswood in Virginia, who sent the attack force. Moore and Moseley's strategy was to prove that North Carolina's colonial officers could not protect their own people. If they tolerated the pirate, that proved incompetence and ownership of the colony would revert to the king. Crown colony status would benefit their faction. Blackbeard was the proof they needed, and his death was the demonstration. It was not about stopping piracy. Spotswood did not care about piracy in North Carolina waters any more than he cared about the weather in Bermuda. He cared about expanding Virginia's influence and settling scores with Eden's administration. The legal problem was not subtle. Spotswood's attack violated British law. One colony could not take enforcement action in another colony without permission from that colony's governor. Eden never asked for help. Nobody on North Carolina's council requested Virginia's involvement. Spotswood knew this. He sent the expedition anyway. After Blackbeard was dead, the conspirators moved fast. Moore and Mosley broke into the state secretary's office looking for evidence of collusion between Knight, Eden, and Blackbeard. They needed documents proving the North Carolina government had been complicit. They tore through the records and found nothing usable. They were convicted for the break-in. A letter found on Blackbeard's body appeared to be from Tobias Knight, suggesting some kind of coordination, but it was not enough to bring down Eden's government. Thomas Pollock, North Carolina's acting governor, wrote about the affair with barely contained contempt. There seems to be a great deal of malice and design in their management of this affair. Spotswood himself faced sharp criticism from Virginia's House of Burgesses for launching an illegal military expedition into another colony. The coup failed. Eden stayed in power and North Carolina remained proprietary. Why did Eden tolerate Blackbeard at all? Economics. Blackbeard's goods sold below market rates, which benefited a poor colony. His battle-hardened crew could serve as an informal militia, which mattered because the Tuscarora War had just ended and the threat of another Native American uprising was real. Eden was not naive. He was pragmatic, and Blackbeard was useful to him. The battle itself happened on November 22, 1718, by the Julian calendar then in use. That translates to December 3rd on our modern Gregorian calendar, deeper into winter than the story usually implies. And the details that get repeated everywhere are mostly wrong. Maynard's sloops entered through Roanoke Inlet, not Ocracoke Inlet. They sailed through Croton Sound. Official records by Captain Ellis Brand state Maynard departed around 9 a.m., approximately 2 hours after sunrise, not in the early grey light before dawn that makes for better cinema. Royal Navy personnel in 1718 wore no uniforms. They looked identical to pirates and merchants. Only the flag told you which side someone was on. The night before, Blackbeard and his crew were drinking. They had no reason to be alert. Ocracoke was their base, their territory. The shallow channels made it difficult for large warships to approach, and no colonial governor had ever sent anyone after them. That confidence was about to become lethal. At dawn, Maynard's 2 sloops, the Jane and the Ranger, moved in through the shallow water. Maynard had hired local pilots who knew the channels. As they approached, Blackbeard hoisted his flag. Maynard raised the Union Jack. Blackbeard shouted across the water, "Damn you 4 villains, who are you?" Maynard answered, "You may see by our colors we are no pirates." Blackbeard had initially assessed the approaching vessels as merchant ships. He did not know they were Royal Navy until the flag went up. Blackbeard's swivel guns tore into Maynard's men. Casualties were heavy on the Jane. Maynard ordered his surviving crew below deck, leaving the sloop looking abandoned. Blackbeard took the bait. He boarded, thinking he had won. Maynard's men surged up from below. Close quarters fighting on a small sloop, swords and pistols at arm's length. Maynard shot Blackbeard and they fought with swords until Maynard was disarmed. Blackbeard took 5 bullets and roughly 20 cuts from blades before he went down. A Scottish Highlander among Maynard's crew engaged him in single combat. According to the accounts, Blackbeard's last words to the Scot were, "Well done, lad." The Highlander took his head off with a broadsword. Maynard hoisted it on the bowsprit. The body went into the water. 2 months before this fight, Blackbeard had gotten into a brawl with a Pamlico planter and had to call for help because he was losing. The image of Blackbeard as some superhuman fighter does not hold up. He was a young man, probably 27, tough enough but not invincible. When the ambush closed around him at Ocracoke, he fought hard and he died hard. The inhuman strength the legends describe finds no support in contemporary records. The story about Blackbeard deliberately steering towards sandbars to trap Maynard's ships appears nowhere in primary sources. It was invented by historian A.B.C. Whipple. Later writers cited Whipple as authority, and the fiction became accepted fact. This is how myths work. Someone invents a detail, someone else cites the invention, and within a generation it is in every textbook. 10 pirates died at Ocracoke, including Blackbeard. Maynard had 11 men wounded. 6 survivors were charged not with piracy but with treason. for firing on the King's Navy. Published sources commonly claim 13 crew members were hanged. Duffus found that most captured crew members were not executed. They went home, some raised families. Their grandchildren, according to Duffus, became grandfathers of American liberty. The men who sailed with Blackbeard contributed descendants to the American Revolution. Duffus makes one more claim that is worth sitting with. He argues Blackbeard might have survived if he had lived for just 3 more weeks. The implication is that a new pardon or some political development was imminent, though the full argument requires reading Duffus's work in detail. Blackbeard's severed head was mounted on a pole at the southern end of the Chesapeake Bay at a spot in Hampton, Virginia, still called Blackbeard's Point. It stayed there for years, bleaching in the salt wind, serving as a warning to any pirate sailing into Virginia waters. According to legend, the skull was eventually taken down, cleaned, and silver-plated, then used as a drinking goblet in a Williamsburg tavern. The skull supposedly changed hands multiple times over the centuries. In the 1950s, maritime historian Edward Rowe Snow claimed to possess it and brought it to public appearances, passing the silver-rimmed skull around for audiences to hold. When Snow died in 1982, his widow donated his collection, skull included, to the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts. There is no chain of custody that proves the skull is authentic. The museum has never confirmed the provenance. This is almost certainly folklore layered on top of folklore. Since 1718, locals on Ocracoke Island have reported seeing a headless figure walking the beaches at night, searching for his head. Others describe a strange light moving beneath the water in Teach's Hole, the anchorage where Blackbeard kept his sloop and where Maynard's men killed him. The ghost stories started almost immediately after the battle and have never stopped. One more myth to bury. Blackbeard was not wealthy. When his possessions at Ocracoke were inventoried and auctioned in Virginia, they totaled approximately £2,500. For context, here is what other pirates of the same era accumulated. Captain William Kidd left behind £14,000 in gold, silver, and jewels. Henry Avery's haul was around £350,000. Sam Bellamy, who went down with his ship the Whydah off Cape Cod, is estimated to have had up to £1 million in cargo. Sir Francis Drake brought home £1.5 million from his circumnavigation in 1582 money. Blackbeard, the most famous pirate who ever lived, would barely qualify as middle management at a modern accounting firm. There are no historical accounts of him burying treasure anywhere, none. The buried treasure legend is a fiction invented by later writers who assumed every pirate had a secret island and a map with an X on it. Popular culture, not history. The treasure that made Blackbeard powerful was never gold. It was the fact that everyone from Charleston to Boston believed he was capable of anything. His crew tells you something about pirate society that rarely makes it into the entertainment versions of this story. At one point, black men made up more than half of Blackbeard's crew. This was not unusual. An estimated 1/3 of all 10,000 pirates active during the Golden Age were black. They came from different paths. Some were formerly enslaved people who escaped or were freed during raids. Some were free black sailors who joined willingly. Some, like Black Caesar, had histories that are difficult to reconstruct with certainty. Caesar was reportedly an African chieftain who had evaded enslavement multiple times before joining the crew. He raided ships in the Florida Keys for almost a decade as an independent operator before coming aboard Queen Anne's Revenge. On Blackbeard's ships, black pirates could vote, bear arms, and receive equal shares of plunder. This was not philanthropy. Pirate ships needed skilled, willing fighters. Racial hierarchies are a luxury for people who have the power to enforce them. Pirates did not. The ships operated under written pirate articles. Captains were elected. They could be voted out for cowardice or incompetence. The captain's authority was absolute only during battle. At all other times, he was another crew member. Where to sail, whether to attack, these decisions went to a democratic vote. The quartermaster managed day-to-day operations and the treasure, functioning as something between a chief financial officer and a check on the captain's power. Loot was distributed by formula. Captain got 2 shares. Quartermaster got 1.5, everyone else got 1. Specialists like the carpenter or surgeon earned bonuses. The code included an injury compensation schedule, specific payouts for specific wounds. Pirates built a working system of elected leadership, equal pay regardless of race, and workplace injury insurance roughly 200 years before any nation managed the same. The wreck itself sits near Beaufort, North Carolina, discovered in 1996. It is the only pirate wreck in the world to be scientifically excavated, and it has produced an enormous volume of material. Over 400,000 artifacts have come up so far, 40 cannons, a mix of English and Swedish manufacture, more than 250,000 pieces of lead shot, over 400 cannonballs and dozens of grenades, remains of wild boar, deer and turkey that tell us what the crew ate, evidence of a French cook working aboard, presumably one of the forced crewmen from La Concorde who decided or was compelled to stay. Only about half the wreck has been studied. Nearly 20,000 artifacts are still in conservation treatment, sitting in tanks and freezers in North Carolina labs. A massive concreted mass in the midships area, which the archaeological team calls the pile, is the most challenging portion to excavate. Centuries of marine growth have fused metal, wood, and sediment into a single block. What is inside it is unknown. In 2018, conservators working on the pile found something unexpected. 16 tiny fragments of paper in wet sludge packed inside a breech-loading cannon chamber. The paper had survived 3 centuries underwater because it was sealed inside the cannon, protected from the salt water and marine organisms that consumed everything else organic on the wreck. After months of painstaking research, they identified the fragments as pages from Captain Edward Cook's 1712 book, A Voyage to the South Sea and Round the World, performed in the years 1708, 1709, 1710, and 1711. This is the first archaeological evidence of a specific book title aboard Blackbeard's vessel. It confirms that the crew took books during raids. Plundered books as well as commodities, as one archaeologist put it. But the content of this particular book adds an odd symmetry to the story. Cook's voyage describes the rescue of Alexander Selkirk, a Scottish sailor marooned alone on a Pacific island for 4 years. Selkirk was the real-life castaway who inspired Daniel Defoe to write Robinson Crusoe, published in 1719, 1 year after Blackbeard's death. Blackbeard's pirates were reading the true account of a castaway, while the most famous fictional castaway story was still being written. Edward Thatch served as a pirate for roughly 2 years and became the most recognized name in the history of piracy. He did it without killing anyone. He did it with a ship he stole from slavers and then scuttled on purpose. He held a major colonial city hostage for medicine. He was betrayed by politics, not defeated by justice. He died at 27, and the man who told his story was probably paid to lie about him. His head rotted on a pole in Virginia. His body is still in the water at Ocracoke. 300 years later, we are still calling him by the wrong name.